It is now my pleasure to turn the webcast over to Dr. Peter Hurst, Executive Director, MIT Sloan Executive Education. Dr. Hurst, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ian. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next in our Innovation at Work webinar series from MIT Sloan Executive Education. We have about 2,500 people registered from all over the world for today's webinar, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And we're delighted that you're able to join us. The Innovation at Work webinar series, as you know, is intended to feature current research from our faculty at MIT Sloan School of Management who teach in our executive education programs. And I'm very delighted today that we're being joined by Hal Gregersen, who is the Executive Director of our Leadership Center at the MIT Sloan School. You can see Hal's resume here, or a little piece of it at least. We couldn't fit the whole thing on the slide, but suffice to say that Hal has really taught at a variety of the world's leading business schools, and we're very delighted that about a year ago Hal decided to come and join us here at MIT Sloan. Hal and his co-authors have really been engaging in some fascinating research by interviewing business leaders around the world about, in particular, innovation and leadership and the link between those two topics. And so it's with very great pleasure that I would like to hand over today's webinar to Hal, who is going to talk to us about his work on the innovator's DNA. Hal Gregersen.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Ian. I apologize to the world for a slightly raspy voice today. I returned a week or two ago from Mount Everest and gratefully am well, and not so much for many people still there. But I am delighted to be here and appreciate the fact that you've joined me around the topic of innovation. It's a word that's on every senior executive's tongue around the world, and sometimes those words have difficulty translating into reality. I'd like to start with a story that illustrates that to some degree. And the story goes way back in time when I was much younger. I was in my late teens, or really early teens, 16 years old. This is the first picture I ever took with a 35mm camera. And I understand it is nothing to look at. It's quite stupid and ugly, but it's meaningful to me because it was the first. I fell in love with that 35mm camera. I ended up taking hundreds and then thousands of images, and ultimately, late in high school, I ended up starting my own little business doing weddings and portraits. And as you can see from the next images, it certainly dates who I am by hairstyles and the kinds of clothing people are wearing. But it was a way in which I could pay my way to get through college and university. Ever since then, I've been fascinated by photography, and wherever I travel in the world, I'm always looking for what's surprising. That question is on my mind in airplanes, in airports, and away from those places, trying to figure out what's interesting. I was in the beaches of Bali, noticing these patterns in the sand, and then walked and noticed this light that had washed up from the sea. And it was amazing to me. It was interesting and fascinating. Last year I was in Santa Fe doing some photography work and was invited to sit inside of this old antique car. And much to my surprise, people started looking inside, and they were just as surprising as the car was. I have ever since then, loved photography, and actually this coming fall we'll be doing at the MIT Sloan Executive Education program around innovation and photography. And that particular dream of my life never could have happened if I had lived in the 1880s. If I had been back then, I grew up in a family that was probably lower class, maybe lower middle class in terms of our economic status, and we didn't have the resources to buy big cameras, and we would not have had cameras in our home. Photography in the 1800s was for professionals. They were large cameras. It was a complex process. It was expensive. Few people had access to it. And during that period of time, George Eastman lived. He worked on the film side of the camera, and he was trying to figure out a better way to make the film move in the back. And he was also trying to figure out a family issue, which was, how could someone like him and his family go on vacation with cameras like this? It just wasn't feasible. It made no sense. And so he was wrestling with the question, how could other people who aren't professionals have a camera and be able to take images? And he wrestled with his question for several years. And ultimately, he's the one who invented a roll of film, and he put it inside of literally a cardboard box. And he wrapped that cardboard box with black paper, and they sold it for US $1. And that single idea, that was the culmination of a lifetime of commitment he had to photography, ended up disrupting the entire photography industry. A colleague of mine, Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School, coined the term disruptive innovation, and essentially here's what's happening. You have a complex, expensive process that relatively few people have access to, which was photography before the Brownie Kodak camera. And that's transformed into something that's simple, it's inexpensive, and it's accessible to millions, if not billions of people. That's what that invention did. It ended up changing the whole photography industry. Well, let's go back now to the Kodak example. 1949, my mother had finished working in the Red Cross during World War II. She was traveling through Europe, stopped in Paris, had her picture taken at the Saint Madeleine Church on the stairs, and it was a Kodak No. 3 camera. And this is what we call a sustaining innovation. It's an improvement on an existing idea, nothing phenomenal, nothing disruptive, makes it a little bit better. It creates value, and sustaining innovations are important, but they do not create as much value as a disruptive idea does. Now back to the Kodak situation. 1963, Fujifilm had operated in Japan essentially as a monopoly. They moved then into the US, into Kodak's market, and they started selling film, and they sold it cheaper than Kodak did. Kodak's initial response was to go to the government and claim that somehow Fujifilm was being subsidized by the Japanese government. They could not make film this cheap. And litigation years later basically concluded, no, Fujifilm just knew how to make film cheaper. And Kodak had to then engage in what we call efficiency innovations. They had to figure out a way to make film as cheap or cheaper than Fujifilm did. Now here's the importance of these three kinds of innovation. When individuals, teams, organizations, or even countries for that matter, start to focus their entire innovation efforts on being more efficient, it usually marks the beginning of the end. And that's what happened to Kodak. Fast forward, 1975. In Kodak labs, they develop and they discover and they invent the first electronic camera. But this is pre-PC, no personal computers. This is pre-internet, no internet. And the images were just poor resolution. There was no reason for Kodak to develop this idea. It sits still, fast forward almost 30 years. 2005, I then moved to Paris. While I was living there, I decided I'm going to have my picture taken at the same place my mother had her picture taken, on the stairs of the Saint Madeleine Church in downtown Paris. And the camera was actually a Kodak camera. It was a Kodak electronic camera. They had a vibrant, successful business in the camera imaging business. Now fast forward just 7 years, 2012. Our daughter was an au pair in Paris. She decided to go where her grandmother had been, have her picture taken in the same place. And at that point, I'm sure you know, the camera was a mobile phone. And essentially, Kodak in 1900, which literally was a disruptor of the whole photography industry, became Kodak the Disrupted, and they went bankrupt that year. Now, I'm not trying to pick on Kodak. It's the story of Nokia. I lived in Finland for 3 years. It's a similar story in their world, and it's the story of many other companies. And it is the story that basically says, when leaders wake up in the morning and go to work, they have a choice. They can engage in actions, they can use their time and energy during the day that will lead them to either be the disruptor or be disrupted, and there's little in between ground. And the reason I say that is that a little over a decade ago, Clayton Christensen, Jeff Dyer, and I, we had a quest about a question. We were trying to figure out, how do individuals and teams come up with these ideas that actually disrupt entire industries? And Clayton Christensen had coined the term. He'd written The Innovator's Dilemma. We talked with him, and we concluded we did not have a good answer. And so what we ended up doing is we looked around the world for companies that were the most innovative and disruptive, and we ended up interviewing and talking with their founders or their CEOs. So we interviewed people like Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, Peter Thiel, who founded PayPal. We interviewed Pierre Omidyar, who founded eBay, Nicholas Zenstrom, who founded Skype. And again, 100 to 200 of these people we talked with. We asked them, tell us about what you were doing when you got these ideas. And what we noticed was there were patterns of action, behaviors they engaged in that were consistent across these people. And those patterns of action we distilled down into a survey assessment of 5 skills of questioning the status quo, observing the world like an anthropologist, networking to talk to new people about getting new ideas, experimenting and just trying things, and associational thinking. And we've collected data from now 12,000 people around the world, and we've discovered that a person doesn't have to be famous to use the same skills that they use. In this database, when anyone uses those skills on a consistent enough basis, the data would say they actually get ideas that create value. New businesses, new products, new services, new process. Not just ideas for ideas' sake, but ideas that generate real value. So what do these innovators do? When they wake up in the morning, how do they go about doing their work? Number one, they really do think differently. And if you pry open their heads, they have a way of looking and thinking in the world that is quite different from the rest of us. They connect the unconnected. They, in Einstein's terms, engage in combinatorial play. It's their way of putting things together that no one else does. And they're able to think differently because they truly act differently. If you were to shadow them and watch their behaviors and watch their actions, you'd be able to see them doing things on a day-to-day basis that make a difference. And as I mentioned earlier, these skills of questioning, observing, networking, experimenting, and associational thinking, they are skills that we had once when we were 4 years old, because wherever we are in the world, these are the things young kids do. And some of us had it beat right out of us when we were growing up, and others kept it strong and alive. And these skills are largely nurture, not nature. About 2/3 of the skill set comes from just the world we grow up in, the world we work in, the schools we're a part of. They either reinforce these skills or they get them out of us. So let's look on the reinforcing side in the positive way. Where do these folks start? Well, they start by asking very provocative catalytic questions. They ask things that literally other people don't ask. Let me give you an example about this. Doug Dietz was an engineer. He worked for GE Healthcare. He designed CAT and MRI scanning machines. His world, his work was focused heavily on putting these machines together, making them not only aesthetically beautiful, but very functional, to be able to get great images of people who are in need of better health care. And I wish I could see your hands. I'd love to ask those that are on the webinar, how many of you have had a CAT or MRI scan before? Most people who have had that, they never want to do it again. It's not a pleasant experience, but it's an important one for getting our health improved. Well, Doug and his team, they were slated to receive a major award for the design and construction and work on these machines. And Doug happened to be in a hospital where children were being put in these machines, children's hospital. Doug was talking with the radiologist in the radiology area, and the radiologist asked Doug to step out into the hallway because a patient was coming. Doug stepped out. He watched the patient coming, a little 7-year-old girl, with her parents, and the closer she got to that room where the CAT MRI scanning machines were, the more she resisted. She started to physically resist. She started to cry. She didn't want to go in there. Her parents had to force her into the room. They called someone to give her a sedative to settle her down, and then they put her on a table, strapped her in, held her tight, and got the images they needed. Doug had never seen a child go through these systems before, and emotionally it hit a deep chord within his soul. He didn't know what to do, but he did know that he had a question he never had before, which was, how can I make and how can my team make these machines safer and more emotionally comfortable for children going into them? He honestly didn't quite have the answer, but then he was obsessed with this question. He went off and he literally learned some of the skills we're talking about today, and his team and they got to work. They went out and they made observations. They went out and they talked to people, and they actually tried a variety of things. And they didn't do the normal kinds of things you might do with observation. First of all, they pretended they were children going through the hospitals. They put pads on their knees. They got on their knees. They got at a child's height. They went through the entire hospital as if they were children. And you see the world differently from that point of view. They went into homes before children ever got to the hospital because the fears are already growing. They watched that process. They talked to them as they were going through it. They rode with them in the car to the hospital. They walked with them through the entire hospital. And then afterwards, there's still things going on, and they went home with the families. They discovered all kinds of things just by making those observations that they had never seen before. They also thought, where else outside of a hospital could we learn and watch some things? So they went to preschools and watched how teachers effectively had children in groups, engaged and actively excited about what they were doing. They went to children's museums, and they ended up watching that process. How do hundreds and thousands of children get processed in a fun way through a system on a daily basis? They talked to all sorts of people, including child psychologists, and they discovered that even babies want to have voice and choice when they're in an experience, and they had to figure out, how can we give voice and choice to these children going through these CAT and MRI scanning machines? They took all these observations, they took these conversations. They then tried a variety of different ways to build and support and create an experience that would be different for these kids. And then they invented what they called the GE Adventure series. They transformed a technical CAT or MRI scanning experience into an adventure. This one's an underwater adventure. This one is a space adventure. This one is a pirate adventure. And in this particular adventure, as the others, the children receive, before they ever get to the hospital, they receive a comic book that explains the adventure they're going on, the characters they're going to meet. And they're able to get ready for it before they ever arrive. When they get to the hospital with a pirate adventure, the staff put a pirate hat on their heads, and then they start to tell them about the adventure they're going on. And they tell them that when you hear these loud bang-bang sounds, that you know as an adult it's the machine that makes the noises when it's taking the images. They tell the children, just be very still, because the pirate ship is going very fast when it's making those loud noises. Hold still. And at the end of all of that, the children are able to get off the machine. They go over to the treasure chest on the right, get a prize, and then the monkey on the left, they push and it swings back and forth, and they're on their way home. What used to be 80% of the children were sedated chemically to go into these machines because they were so afraid of them, literally turned the other direction. Only 20% of the children do today, and many of the kids, when they leave this experience, the adventure, they're often asking their parents, when can I go back? Well, this whole adventure was not only powerful for the children in making their experience better, but it also had a deep impact on Doug Dietz and his team. And we're now going to show a quick video about Doug talking about his experience after the fact.
why I really wrapped myself around this and tried my best to pull in some of the best people that I could to work with me is that I always kept in my mind that frightened child that was going through cancer or that was really having some problems going through their scan. And that is such a tough thing for a little one. It's such a tough thing for a family. And I did put my heart and soul behind it. And it means a lot to me now that we have a solution, and that the solution is helping the way it is, and it's helping these families.
One of the very powerful elements of Doug's experience, having gotten out of his office, gone into the world, understood a child's world, was Doug, as you obviously could see, gained a much deeper empathy at an emotional level, a connection to these kids who are going through these machines. And what we've discovered, when people get out of their offices, they get into the world, they start interacting by observing and talking and just experimenting and trying things. What we discovered is it's a powerful mechanism to create connections with the people we're trying to serve with our products and services. And that kind of connection is one that Kathleen Capson, whom we also talked to, she had worked with Doug and his team. She is the chief radiologist at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh in the United States. In conversations with Kathleen, she had a very similar experience. She was already deeply committed emotionally to these kids, and that was her life's work. But by the end of this whole experience, one of the things she discovered is that before, when they were putting kids through the typical older machines, she cared deeply about a single question. And the question was, how can we get the best technical image for these children? And it's a legitimate question, because getting a good technical image was key to these kids being saved and being in a better situation. But she realized, after doing the work they did, and Doug's team did his work, she realized by the end of it all, her question changed. And the question they care deeply about now is, how can we make this whole experience emotionally safe for these children? And by changing the question, they changed the entire experience. And it ended up actually getting better technical images because the kids were far more settled as they went into these machines. I find this a very powerful story. It's a powerful story around the skills of asking the right questions, getting out and observing, networking and talking to people that we don't normally talk to, experimenting and trying small, fast, and cheap things just to get something going and not just talk about innovating. And as Kathleen experienced in her situation, it's the same for all of us. One of the most difficult and important jobs, as Peter Drucker said, is never to find the right answers. It's to find the right questions. And he added on, there's nothing more dangerous or useless than the right answer to the wrong question. We live in a world that's sometimes too answer-centric. And we live in a world that sometimes crushes our capacity to ask the right questions. But changing our questions is key to getting a new solution in a situation. I suspect that all of you, like me, we have challenges. I certainly have personal challenges, and also ones I face professionally. And for the optimists on the webinar, maybe they're opportunities and not challenges, but these are things that we're vexed with, things we're struggling with, things we don't have the answers to. And I'm sure you've got at least one in your mind's eye that you're trying to get a solution to, but you're stuck. It might be you, it might be your team at work. But imagine yourself in that kind of situation. What I'd like to share is a methodology that can be a great starting point down this trail or journey of innovation. It's a methodology that I discovered years ago, teaching a group of people, and we were stuck. We were wrestling with an issue, and we just could not get a better perspective on it. And I suddenly had this thought, let's just ask nothing but questions about this issue. So we changed our conversation, and we literally wrote down several, at least 100 questions, I'm sure. And asking all those questions enabled us to see the situation differently. And since then, we've built this methodology called catalytic questioning, where first of all, we pick a challenge or a possibility, something that you've got in your mind's eye. And then what we do is we brainstorm nothing but questions. Literally, nothing but questions. It's really easy for leaders, when a question gets asked, to give answers. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction. Question asked, leader answers. With this particular methodology, don't do that. Just ask questions. The other thing that sometimes happens when we ask questions in a group is that sometimes we take 5-10 minutes to explain why we're asking the question. And again, don't do that. Don't explain the question, don't answer the question, just ask the question. I do this on a regular basis. I do it, and it takes me, I usually do it in about 4-minute bursts. I do it around personal issues. I do it around professional issues. And what I find is that when I focus on asking nothing but questions, what happens is it suspends my convictions about my problem. It opens my heart and mind up to seeing it differently, and it enables me to ask a different question, which is just what Peter Drucker talked about. It's not the right answer, it's the right question that opens up new doors to answer our old problems. And so once you do that, you can do it individually, you can do it with another person, you can do it with a trio of people. I find it valuable to engage others because they have different perspectives. In that 4-minute block, you can get about 20 questions. I've done this hundreds of times, and it's about 20 questions. If you're getting less than that, you're either answering the questions too much or you're explaining them too much. Now, once you have that list of new questions and you've figured out better ways of different questions to ask, look through that list and decide which ones are hot, which ones are worth my time and energy to go out and actually get an answer by actively observing and networking and experimenting. And once, one way of looking at those questions is which ones are surprising, which ones are really questions I've never seen before, which questions are uncomfortable, which questions have caused me to not feel easy about, or they make me feel uneasy when I ask them. Which questions might be generative? They could help me get some new ideas if I went and actually got an answer to that question. And one of the things that I would propose and suggest that any leader in the world considers is, when was the last time someone asked you an uncomfortable question? And honestly, if it's been more than a week, I would be concerned, because that means they probably don't trust you or me enough to ask us the tough questions. And if they're not asking us, they're asking somebody else. And that might lead other people or other organizations to be the disruptors instead of you. So work hard to create a safe space where people can ask those uncomfortable questions. This methodology of catalytic questioning can help us do that. It creates a safe space where people actually ask the tough things. And then what we know from our data is that people who just ask questions do not get innovative ideas that are valuable. In other words, if all we do is ask questions all day and we don't do anything about those questions, we're actually annoying to most people. I don't care what culture I'm in. People who just ask 1,000 questions but never take action to answer those questions, they are truly annoying people. And so don't be that way. Ask the questions and then get to work. Let me share a couple of examples of people who have done this with me. Ahmet Bozer is the president of Coca-Cola International. He's responsible for everything outside of North America for Coca-Cola. A few years ago, he and his top 40 managers were trying to figure out a tough strategic issue. They were stuck. They didn't have a solution. We got together. We put them in groups of 5 or 6. I told each group, I want 100+ questions out of you about this issue. They groaned, but they did it. And they worked hard. And they got more than 100 questions. We had hundreds of questions from which we then decided these are the few, 2 or 3, that are worth pursuing. And then they got to work, and they tried to answer them. Similarly, Bea Perez is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Coca-Cola. I was with her late last year in Atlanta at headquarters for Coca-Cola. We were talking about an issue that she had been stuck on strategically, and one of her colleagues was with her, and I said, Bea, let's take 4 minutes. We're just going to ask nothing but questions here about your problem. And she's like, okay, we'll try. And we did it. And 4 minutes later, she had the same response that I get all over the world with this methodology, which is she started to see the problem differently, which helped her change her questions and go down a path to better solve the challenge. And so the real thing here is that in the end we are our choices, and truly build yourself a great story. Innovation is a choice. It's a choice about how we spend our time. It's a choice about the things we do. It's a choice about whether we stay in our offices or get out of them, into the world, actively collecting data. Primary data, not relying on somebody else's point of view, but getting out there and observing and talking and trying things. This is what leaders do who found these companies that have literally changed the world. And we know from our data that CEOs who are innovative at innovative companies spend twice as much of their personal time at work using these skills compared to non-innovative CEOs at non-innovative companies. That translates into 4 months out of their year, literally 4 months, 1/3 of their week, 1/3 of their day, 1/3 of their month and year is consistently spent asking provocative questions, observing like anthropologists, networking and talking to people who aren't like them, getting out there and just experimenting and trying small, fast, cheap things. They do this stuff so consistently that they get ideas that generate value. Contrast that with non-innovative CEOs at non-innovative companies. They spend about 2 months, half the time. It's not that they don't do it. It's that they don't do it enough. And so the biggest story here for leaders trying to be innovative is that it starts at the top. We don't delegate these skills to someone else. We do it ourselves. We get out there and out of our offices into the world actively solving problems by using these skills to deeply empathize with the people we're trying to serve with our products and our services. Now, not only does this skill set need to reside at the top of an innovative company, it needs to be embedded throughout. And innovative companies embed these skills and value these skills and teach these skills throughout the entire system. Let me give you a quick example of work where someone made a difference by helping others use these skills to make a difference. I was in South Africa a couple of years ago and ran across a story about Cedar Citrus. They're an orange grove company. They grow oranges in South Africa. Andries Fixter is an irrigation worker. His job, make sure the water gets into the right places in the groves. But Andries Fixter, at the core, is also an innovator. He's an observer. He pays careful attention to the world around him. He noticed that the baboons that loved to steal things were coming onto property, and they were consistently going down certain paths, and he's like, where are they going? And why are they here? Because the fruit isn't ripe. They shouldn't be here. He then follows and observes and watches and realizes the baboons are going to one place, one tree, all the time. He goes up to that tree. He ends up actually picking a piece of fruit off, thinking this can't be ripe, opens it up, smelled ripe, tasted it, juicy, sweet, perfect fruit. It made no sense to him. He took the piece of fruit, talked to his supervisor. This is the moment of innovation truth. Somebody makes an observation, has an idea, comes to the supervisor, tells him about it. The supervisor could have said, Andries, get back to work. Your job is irrigation. But he listened. Then they went to the technical people. What's going on here? Why is this fruit ripe? And they discovered that the tree had mutated genetically. And the tree was producing 2 seasons of fruit in a single season. And what they then did was they replanted the entire groves, and they couldn't keep it within Cedar Citrus. This variety is now throughout South Africa. But all of that came from someone paying careful attention, making good observations, and the system being responsive to those ideas, and it made all the difference. So the point becomes, as leaders, people are watching. We all know that. So whatever the challenge is that you've got, you don't have a solution to, actively use these skills now, not next week. Use the catalytic questioning to get a better questioning today. Spend 4 minutes with yourself or with your team doing it, just generating new questions. And then actively spend some time. Where could we go observe? Whom could we talk to? What could we try in order to get some better solutions? When we do that as leaders, we enable and empower other people to do the same. And it's not only at work this is important, but it's also critical in the schools around us, in the world we live in. Most kids, when they're growing up, are incredibly curious. They use all of these skills. A 4-year-old anywhere, they observe, they network, they talk, they experiment, they try, they question. These are 4-year-olds. This is a picture of Matthew. He was a neighbor of ours, and we lived in France, and he was looking in this hole. I took the image, and I realized as soon as I took it that Matthew was going to put his hand in that hole. And as soon as I snapped the shot, that's what Matthew did. He was just curious, like any 4-year-old is. But the challenge is, all of us are born curious, but a lot of us have it pounded out of us, as James Watson, one of the the people who found the actual DNA structure. It gets pounded out of us. You know, how does that happen? Let me give an example around questioning. In the U.S., for example, the average student in a 1-hour class during an entire month asks 1 question per month. The average teacher asks between 50 to 100 questions per hour. Children learn really fast. Answers matter more than questions, and they stop asking the questions. Those teachers, they'll be shooting 50 to 100 questions per hour. They'll give the average student 1 second to answer the first question, and if they don't get an answer, it's a half a second to answer the follow-up question. This leads people when they're young to stop asking and just start answering. And it creates what I think is a global questioning crisis, not just for kids, but often for adults, where they've stopped asking the tough, important questions. So my suggestion is, whether it be at work or whether it be at home, it's think about what we're doing to help reinforce these skills. In this case, question, and keep the questions alive. I'll never forget taking this image of one of our granddaughters, Stella. I was looking down, she was looking up, and I snapped several images, and it wasn't until I looked at the image later that I realized just how carefully she was watching me. And it's a powerful reminder for me, not just of the children around us in our homes or communities, but also of the people we work with. They are watching. And the important issue around innovation and the story of the innovator's DNA is hopefully they're watching us use these skills to solve real problems. I hope they see us asking the questions nobody asks. I hope they see us taking the time to watch and look for surprises. I hope they see us talking to people who are not like us. They're the opposites, different industries, different geographies, different nationalities, different socioeconomic status. I hope they watch us make experiments and fail and not see it as failure, but just see it as one step towards getting a solution that really matters. They're my hopes, not only for the young people of the world, but for every leader, that these skills become a part of their everyday action set. And to me, when that happens, and the data is convincing around this, if we just use these skills on a regular basis, they do make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hal. We'll now move into a phase of some questions and answers and discussions. And thank you to those of you who have been asking questions throughout the last 40 minutes or so. Please do feel free to continue to ask questions using the website. And I will take those and maybe put them together and try to get Hal engaged in a conversation about these. So just to get us started, Hal, thank you very much for that great overview. We've got a few themes emerging from the questions I've been looking at so far, and one of them perhaps at a very high level. You've given a couple of examples in this talk of companies and industries that have gone through disruption, but several people are curious about your perspective, given all the companies and business people you've been talking to. What in your mind are the industries or companies that are right now facing the biggest disruptive challenges? And do you have any thoughts about what kinds of questions you're seeing people asking about those industries or companies?
Well, I mean, for me, one of the industries that's most likely to be disrupted is the one we're sitting in right here, the educational space. Not only universities, but all level of education is being powerfully transformed by ideas that used to be expensive, limited access sort of options for people, where you now have simple, inexpensive options for people to get access to educational opportunities. And it wasn't until I became deeply engaged a few years ago around an innovation online experience that I personally realized, I had always thought to myself, I could never be replaced. And I always thought that an online learning experience could never be engaging for people. And I realized through getting deeply immersed in it myself, not true. It's just rapidly changing into a space where I could be replaced and I could be, displaced. And so, and I look at a lot of my peers who, from my perspective, don't get it. They really believe that, things are going to perpetuate as is in the educational space, but it is rapidly changing and will continue to do so. So that's one example from my perspective.
And that's fascinating, and obviously we're very interested in that, given where we're sitting. As you said, what would be a question that you would ask me as a leader in this space then?
Well, so for example, I think it's really important as a teacher to engage people in a conversation that's meaningful. And as an adult now in my mid-50s, it's difficult for me to imagine meaningful engagement in an electronic sphere without face-to-face interaction like we do in traditional classrooms. But my sense is that other generations and other people actually do have fairly engaging conversations that are not face-to-face. And so it's like, what other mediums would allow for some of the same powerful learning effects? And to me, then I start exploring, what are some other options? And prior to that, I wasn't even asking that question. I didn't even believe it could be.
So just following on that theme, which I think is helpful for us to think about, we've had a few questions about, you sort of set out the methodology that you've used in a couple of settings, but as you have been applying this technique yourself, have you found that there is a kind of an optimum methodology for generating this large number of questions, and then for filtering and sorting them? One of your slides you said find out the hot questions, but we're at MIT where process is often important. Have you discovered any particular methods that you would advise people to try out for that?
Well, a couple of things. So, there's a shorter version and a longer version. The shorter version, I talked about that 4 minutes. That's something I do on a fairly consistent basis, and I'm actually in the process of building a mobile app around this because it's what I do to solve personal and professional issues. So I literally, as a process, it's like, okay, what's the challenge? And then I take 10 seconds. What's my emotional feeling about that issue? Because emotions and having positive emotions put us in a better innovation creation space. And most challenges put us in a negative emotional space. So I literally, it's like, okay, what's the challenge? Then it's, what's my emotional? I do a quick emotion check. Boom, done, 5 seconds. Then I set my timer for 4 minutes, 20 questions. Then I do an emotion check. Am I in a better emotional place? And if I'm not, I do the 4 minutes again. And usually, 2 times I'll get into a better space. And then I step back at a process level and it's like, okay, which of these questions for me ring around 3 issues? 1, are they surprising? Are they uncomfortable? Or are they generative? Meaning, if I chase that question, I could probably get a better solution here. Those are 3 things that help me. And if they're not surprising, if they're not uncomfortable, and if there's no hope with these questions, then I'm probably asking questions out of my office, in my office, meaning I haven't been in the world enough to be provoked, pushed, and troubled by customers in my face, customers using my stuff. You know, that's the stuff that helps me see things differently. And then once I decide on those one or two questions, then it's an action plan. It's around, what am I going to do about those questions? And I literally think through, okay, whom could I talk to? Where could I go watch something? What could I try? And I pick one and I try it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's literally that sort of a process.
And do you typically start with a hypothesis in mind, or are you more trying to start in the true kind of whiteboard sense?
To me, I do this, it's a stuck issue. I'm stuck.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be, I've got some issue with my wife, you know. She and I aren't talking to each other. I'm serious, you know, that happens. We love each other, we have a good relationship, but there are moments when we're like not talking. And so I'll literally write down, you know, I'm stuck. What's going on here? And then my emotion, probably negative, and then it's like questions, 4 minutes of it. And by the end of it, I start seeing things differently.
Mm-hmm.
You know, professionally, I was moderating a panel at the World Economic Forum Davos meetings a few years ago. And I was stuck. I could not for the life of me figure out what are the key 3 to 4 issues for this panel tomorrow. So that night, 4 minutes, boom, nothing but questions. I just wrote them down. Went to sleep, woke up the next morning, used those criteria. Which ones seemed to fit here? 3 to 4 questions popped out, and they were just right for the moderating the panel. But I've seen this happen over and over and again. It's like generate, get a lot, and then look and winnow it down to ones that matter.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful, thank you. One sort of theme of questions that I've just been seeing coming through as well, which I think is quite fascinating. In one of your earlier slides, you really talked about the role of, if you like, the hierarchical leader, and you alluded a little bit to the notion of a more distributed leadership model in organizations. So what's your sense of, you know, where, clearly we understand that you would advocate that the CEO should be engaging in this practice, but how do you reconcile that with ideas of distributed leadership? And maybe an extension of that question some people have been asking is, what if I'm in either a particular organization or an industry or a business that, because it's overregulated or for whatever reason, is sort of has antibodies to innovation and to these, you know, to people asking these kinds of questions?
Well, I mean, so we've done a lot of work, for example, with AT&T, and their innovation premium it's a big company, and it's regulated, and it's got a long history, and you know, it's got layers of people. But you know, by trying to embed these skills deeply across the system, everybody gets engaged in using these skills to solve real problems, and they've actually increased what we call an innovation premium, which is a company has a share price, and part of that is attributable to the existing businesses. And there's an additional part that's a premium that has no relationship or connection to existing businesses, and shareholders will pay a premium because they believe something new and different is happening here. And so what we've discovered in doing that analysis of companies around the world is high innovation premium companies, these skills, these innovators' DNA skills, don't just reside at the top. It is a distributed organization-wide skill set that all can engage in them, and all are expected and all are taught to use them. There's a company in Japan called the Keyence Corporation. I never had heard of this company until we did this initial innovation premium analysis. They make sensors for manufacturing environments, and they're one of the most innovative companies in the world. I'd never heard of them. Come to find out, they have embedded observation skills deeply in the system. So a salesperson goes out, goes into a manufacturing environment. They are so good at noticing surprises, nuances, subtleties that is in that manufacturing environment. They then go back to the technical people and they design a solution that's perfect for that particular place. And their customers love them for it. And it's no wonder that they're a high innovation premium, because they've used these skills not just at the top, but it's across the entire organization. And it's not some fancy consumer products organization. This is a boring company that makes sensors for manufacturing environments. So it can work in any space, but it tends to have to start at the top. The leaders themselves have to be doing this stuff. but then they have the deep commitment to others doing it. Jeff Bezos at Amazon told us, my job as a leader is to make a safe enough space here that thousands, not hundreds of experiments happen at Amazon. And that's their whole logic. It's not just Bezos doing it, it's lots of people.
So this question of creating a safe space for these questioning and experimenting behaviors, some might be arguing that there's a flip side to that. In high-performance team theory, one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to is how to handle derailers. So as you look at the organizations that have really excelled in this sort of questioning approaches, do you have any insights into how they handle maintaining that openness while not being derailed?
Most disruptive innovators they're mavericks. They're probably a bit narcissistic, and you know, they are challenges often. But what they're doing is they collect enough data on the fringes of a system that they push it. Mm-hmm. And what any team or organization has to figure out is how do we respond to the people who are pushing the system. And what we, you know, let me give a quick example, and it goes a bit back in time, but it's a relevant one, I believe. When Steve Jobs was young at Apple, he's obviously an innovator, and he pushed the system really hard, and he got fired because the company was trying to move from 200 million to $1 billion. Steve didn't want to listen to systems, didn't want to follow procedures, didn't want to go along with what was required to build a $1 billion company. He gets fired. I think part of why he got fired is he, the innovator, didn't deeply respect the people on the system execution results side. Well, he goes off and he founds Next, a new computer company, and it fails. It's another big failure. And then he buys Pixar, which wasn't Pixar then, and then it transforms as a Pixar. It's a whole different industry. It's a media company. It's not a computer company. And he has to work with people who are PhDs and really smart at what they do, and it's a whole different relationship. Then he goes back to Apple in the 90s. And who's one of the first people he hires? Tim Cook, who had been a supply chain operations specialist all of his life. And to me, that's a huge symbol. It's Steve Jobs #2, you know, revisited, Renaissance Steve, finally realizes and respects deeply that other side. And so whether it's a team or a top team or an organization, one of the most powerful indicators of whether these innovation skills will make a difference is the degree to which the deviants, the innovators, the people who are getting the disruptive ideas actually get respected by the people who are the operators, the deliverers, the ones that get things done, and vice versa. Because once they honor and respect what each brings to the conversation, the ideas not only get generated, but they get implemented. And you know, you can easily see in the fabric of an organization whether that honor and respect exists. And if it doesn't, you know, things just don't happen.
And so if you find yourself in an organization that you feel is not receptive, what's your advice? Is it find yourself a different organization or change the organization?
For me, it's start small, think big. And start small means use these 5 skills we talked about today to solve problems that you are responsible for. And it could be, I'm not even a manager, I'm a technical professional, I've got an issue, I've got a challenge. Use these skills because they will enable you or anybody to get a better solution than they would otherwise. Then if I've got a team, do the same thing. We still have a sphere of responsibility. I can use these skills to solve problems better in my space. There may come a point in time, if the system is so resistant to me caring enough about end users that I'm going to solve problems creatively to get there, there may come a point at which I've got to decide, time to move on. And my experience is, and you know, there are a couple of great examples I could give if we had time, but essentially, I'll give one. You know, Gavin Semenowitz, South African, never saw himself as innovative. You know, he went through his, you know, career, got into his mid-30s, finally had a boss who came to him and said, Gavin, do you have any ideas around here? And Gavin's like, you know, not me. I'm talking to the wrong guy. Gavin ended up being taught by his boss how to use these skills and solve the problem. And he got so good at it that he ended up actually going off and starting his own business. And I guess what I'm suggesting with Gavin's example is that, you may not necessarily go off and start your own business, but if I use these skills, it's not just about getting ideas. It's about getting ideas that make an impact. And if I do that, I'm going to be more valuable on the market as an employee for somebody. And so my recommendation is, even in a system that shuts it down, it's still worth building the skill around the things I'm responsible for. And at some point, I may have to move on.
Great. Thank you. That's a very insightful and provocative answer, I think, to many of us. And we do have some further reading that we would recommend to anyone who would like to delve into these ideas more. And I think it's also the case, Hal, that you continue to have further research and book projects going on. So we'll continue to share with all of our contacts that information too. I mentioned at the beginning that Hal does teach in a couple of executive education programs here at Sloan and also in several of our custom programs, and you can also see some information here as well. This webinar is being recorded. We'll make the slides and recording available to you afterwards, and so you will be able to get all this information again. Also, immediately at the end of this broadcast, we'll be moving to a live Facebook chat, and the link is coming up now. Excuse me, I was looking behind me, which is always a bad thing to do. Asking the wrong question. And so Hal has agreed to hang around with us and perhaps explore one of those questions he was just asking us earlier about the education space, which are one of the ways that we can interact in engaging ways with people to help them learn. And we'll be trying that in a Facebook chat in about 1 minute's time. So it really remains for me to thank Hal Gregersen very much for this phase of the live broadcast, to thank the team here and all of you for making this possible and making it happen. And we will be, in the next 20 or 30 seconds, moving over to the live Facebook chat. And hopefully we'll see many of you there.
Thank you.
Thanks to all participants for joining us today. Once again, a link to the Facebook discussion with Professor Gregersen should have appeared on your screen. We hope you found this webcast presentation informative. This concludes our webcast. You may now disconnect. Have a good day.